Story 1. The Woman in the Window. Michael Brennan had been renting the cabin outside Boone, North Carolina for 3 months when he first saw her. A freelance graphic designer from Charlotte, he'd sought the isolation of the Blue Ridge Mountains to finish a major project on deadline. The cabin sat at the end of a 4-mile dirt road, surrounded by dense hardwood forest that seemed to swallow sound itself. The nearest neighbor was 7 miles down the mountain, and cell service was non-existent without driving 20 minutes toward town. The cabin was simple but comfortable: 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and large windows facing the valley below. Michael appreciated those windows during the day, watching fog roll through the hollows like something alive. At night, he kept the curtains drawn. Something about those black panes reflecting his lamp-lit interior back at him felt wrong, like the darkness was watching him watch himself. It was late October when his routine changed. He'd been working past midnight, fueled by coffee and the pressure of his deadline, when movement outside caught his eye. Just a flicker in his peripheral vision, there and gone. He looked up from his laptop to the window across the room. The curtains were open. He was certain he'd closed them earlier. Through the glass, he saw only his own reflection and the darkness beyond. Michael stood and crossed to the window, reaching for the curtain cord. That's when he saw her. 20 feet from the cabin at the tree line stood a woman in a white dress. She was perfectly still, facing the window, facing him. The moonlight was bright enough that he could see her clearly: pale skin, dark hair hanging loose past her shoulders, bare feet despite the October chill. But he couldn't make out her face. The shadows fell wrong there, obscuring her features completely. His heart hammered as he stumbled backward. He grabbed his phone, no service as always. The landline the owner had mentioned wasn't connected. He was alone. When he looked back at the window, she was gone. Michael pulled the curtains closed so hard the rod nearly came down. He spent the rest of the night on the couch, facing the door, a kitchen knife on the cushion beside him. Morning brought rational explanations. A neighbor he didn't know about. Someone hiking who got lost. A prank. He almost believed it until he went outside and found no footprints in the soft earth where she'd stood. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and his own boots left clear impressions, but where the woman had been, nothing, as if she'd never touched the ground at all. He told himself to leave. Pack up, break the lease, go back to Charlotte. But the project was due in 2 weeks, and starting over somewhere else would cost him the client. He stayed. And that night he kept all the curtains closed from sunset on. She appeared again 3 nights later. Michael was washing dishes at the kitchen sink when he felt it, that crawling sensation of being watched. The small window above the sink had no curtain. He looked up and she was there, pressed against the glass from outside. Her face was inches from his, separated only in pain. This time he could see her features. Her eyes were completely black, no whites at all, and her mouth was open too wide, impossibly wide, as if her jaw had become unhinged. No sound came through the glass, but he could see down her throat into a darkness that seemed to go on forever. Michael screamed and fell backward, crashing into the kitchen table. Dishes shattered on the floor. When he looked again, she was gone. He ran to the front door, locked as he'd left it. He checked every window, all locked. He spent that night in his car with the engine running, headlights on, parked in front of the cabin. The next day, he drove to Boone and told the property owner, an elderly man named Vernon Hayes, about the woman. Vernon's face went gray. He asked Michael to describe her again, listening with growing unease. When Michael finished, Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Then he told Michael the story. In 1974, a young woman named Sarah Dempsey had rented that same cabin for the summer. She was an artist from Virginia, seeking inspiration in the mountains. In August, hikers found her body in the woods a quarter-mile from the cabin. She'd been dead for at least 2 weeks. She was wearing a white dress and had been walking barefoot. The autopsy showed she'd died of exposure and dehydration, but what disturbed investigators was that she'd been found less than 20 minutes walk from the cabin, moving in circles. Her feet were bloody and torn, her fingernails broken from clawing at trees. The trees bore strange marks, as if she'd been trying to carve symbols into the bark. The investigation revealed something stranger. Sarah's journal, found in the cabin, contained increasingly frantic entries about a woman who appeared at her windows at night. A woman in a white dress who looked exactly like Sarah herself. In the final entry, dated the day Sarah apparently wandered into the woods, she wrote, "She's inside now. I can see myself standing in the doorway, but I'm here writing this. Which one of us is real? I need to find out. I'm going to follow her into the woods. If I don't come back, it means she was the real Sarah and I was the one in the window all along." Vernon admitted he should have told Michael about the history. He'd rented the cabin dozens of times since 1974 without incident. Michael was the first person to report seeing her in over 20 years. Michael returned to the cabin only to pack. He worked frantically in daylight, throwing his belongings into boxes and bags. He was loading the last box into his car when he saw her one final time. She stood in the cabin's doorway watching him, still in the white dress, still barefoot. He could see her face clearly in the afternoon sun. It was his own face looking back at him. His features on her body, his eyes in her sockets, his mouth curved in a smile he wasn't making. He drove away and never returned. The property owner had to hire someone to retrieve the belongings Michael left behind. Vernon told him later that the worker reported feeling watched the entire time but saw nothing unusual. Michael moved back to Charlotte and threw himself into his work, but something changed that he can't explain. Sometimes, when he catches his reflection unexpectedly, in a darkened window, a turned-off monitor, a mirror glimpsed in passing, the face looking back doesn't move quite in sync with his movements. The delay is barely perceptible, just a fraction of a second, but it's there, as if his reflection is making its own decisions about how to mimic him, as if something else is looking out through the glass, learning how to be him, waiting patiently for its moment to step through and take his place while he becomes the one trapped in the reflection, pressed against the inside of every window, trying desperately to get someone's attention before he's forgotten entirely. He never looks at windows after dark anymore. And he started noticing that sometimes his reflection is wearing a white dress. Story 2. The knock pattern. James Whitfield spent 15 years working as a software engineer in Boston before burning out completely. At 42, divorced and exhausted, he decided to take a year off and rented a cabin in the Appalachian region of West Virginia, near the Virginia border. The cabin was outside a town called Marlinton, population barely over 1,000, situated in the Monongahela National Forest. It was exactly what he needed: extreme isolation, no internet, spotty cell service, and nothing but time to figure out what came next in his life. The cabin belonged to a local family who'd owned the property for generations. It was well maintained but rustic, heated by a wood stove, with propane for cooking and solar panels for minimal electricity. The closest neighbor was 5 miles away. James arrived in early December just as the first serious snow began to fall. The cabin owner, a woman named Ruth Sanderson, helped him unload his supplies and gave him a tour of the property. Before she left, Ruth hesitated at the door. "You'll hear things out here at night," she said. "Animals, wind, the forest settling. Don't pay it any mind. But if you hear knocking," she paused, seeming to reconsider. "Well, just don't answer the door after dark unless you're expecting someone, which you..." James thanked her and watched her truck disappear down the mountain road. He spent the first week settling in, splitting wood, organizing supplies, and enjoying the profound quiet. At night, he read by lamplight and listened to the wind move through the pines. He did hear sounds, branches creaking, something that might have been owls, the occasional scurrying of small animals in the walls. Nothing concerning. The knocking started on his 9th night. 3 sharp raps on the front door, clear and distinct. James looked up from his book. It was nearly 11 o'clock. He went to the door but didn't open it, calling out instead, "Who's there?" No answer. He looked through the small window beside the door but saw only darkness and falling snow. After a few minutes, he went back to his chair, convincing himself it was a branch blown against the door. The next night, the same thing. 3 knocks evenly spaced at 11:14. This time, James opened the door immediately. Nothing. Fresh snow on the porch showed no footprints. The nearest trees were 30 feet away. He closed and locked the door, feeling uneasy but not yet frightened. The pattern continued every night for a week. Always 3 knocks, always between 11 and midnight, always leaving no trace. James tried staying at the door, watching through the window. The knocks came from behind him, from the back door instead. He tried keeping lights on. Darkness didn't matter. The knocks came regardless. On the 15th night, the pattern changed. 3 knocks on the front door as usual. But after James called out with no response, there were 3 knocks on the back door. Then 3 on the east window, then the west. Something was circling the cabin, knocking in sequence, moving impossibly fast. James stood in the center of the single room, turning slowly, following the sound as it went around and around. The knocking grew faster, more insistent. When it finally stopped, James was shaking. He drove to town the next morning and found Ruth at her family's hardware store. He told her everything. She listened with a grim expression that told him she'd heard this before. She took him to the back office and pulled out a leather journal from a desk drawer. It had belonged to her grandfather, who'd built the cabin in 1928. The journal contained sporadic entries spanning decades. Several mentioned the knocking. Her grandfather had heard it. So had various family members who'd stayed there. The entries were brief and unhelpful until James found one from 1952, written by Ruth's father when he was 19 years old. "The knocking came again last night. I finally looked up what Grandpa told me before he died. There was a cabin here before ours, built in the 1980s. A family lived there, the Morrows. Father, mother, 3 children. In the winter of 1889, a stranger came to their door one night during a blizzard, knocking for shelter. The father, suspicious of strangers, refused to answer. The knocking continued all night. In the morning, they found the stranger frozen on their porch. After that, the knocking never stopped. It came every night until the family went mad. The father killed them all with an axe, then himself. They say the stranger wasn't human, that he was something from the deep woods that needed to be invited in, and the knocking is his way of asking permission. The rule is simple: never answer, never invite, never acknowledge. As long as you ignore it, you're safe. The moment you engage with it, you've opened the door." James felt ice in his stomach. "I called out," he said. "The first night I asked who was there." Ruth's face went pale. "Did you open the door?" "Yes, but nothing was there." "You have to leave," Ruth said. "Tonight, now." But James hesitated. His lease was paid through June. He had nowhere else to go, no plan, no money for another place. He convinced himself it would be fine. He'd stop responding. He'd ignore it completely. Ruth begged him to reconsider, but he drove back to the cabin. That night, the knocking came at 7 o'clock, then 8, then 9, 10, 11. 3 knocks every hour on the hour, circling the cabin. James sat in his chair, hands over his ears, reciting song lyrics to drown out the sound. At midnight, the knocking stopped. In the sudden silence, James lowered his hands, taking a shaking breath. Then he heard it. A voice outside, muffled by the walls. It was calling his name. James, James Whitfield. It was his own voice calling to him. Perfect mimicry. His voice said, "Please let me in. It's cold. I'm freezing. Please." His voice cracked with desperation, with suffering. "James, please. I'm dying out here." Wanted to open the door. Some deep instinct, some fundamental human response to hearing his own voice in distress, compelled him toward the door. His hand was on the knob when he stopped himself. "It's not me," he thought. "I'm in here. That's something else." The voice changed tactics. Now it was his ex-wife crying, "James, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Please, can we talk?" Then his mother, dead for 3 years. "Jamie, sweetie, I'm lost. Help me find my way home." Then his best friend from college. Then coworkers, cousins, his childhood neighbor. Every voice perfect, every plea desperate and personal, cycling through everyone he'd ever known, all of them begging to come inside, all of them freezing, dying, needing him. James collapsed on the floor, weeping, hands pressed to his ears. Continued until dawn. When the sun rose, they stopped. The silence was overwhelming. He packed and left within an hour. Ruth refunded his lease without question. As James drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw a figure standing on the cabin's porch. It was him, or something wearing his shape. It raised one hand and knocked 3 times on the air, watching him leave. James moved to Florida, as far from the mountains as he could get. He lives in a 4th-floor apartment with no porch, no isolated surroundings, no silence. But sometimes, late at night, he hears it. 3 soft knocks on his apartment door. He never answers. He never even looks through the peephole, because just once he made that mistake. He looked, and standing in the hallway, illuminated by the fluorescent lights, was himself, smiling, knocking, waiting to be invited in. When he pulled away from the peephole, he heard his own voice through the door. "I know you're in there, James. I'll keep knocking. Eventually, you'll forget and you'll open the door thinking it's someone else. And when you do, I'll finally come home." He's thinking about moving again. But he's starting to suspect that no matter where he goes, it will follow. Because he answered that first night. He engaged. He opened the door. And something out there in the mountains took that as permission to keep trying. Story 3. The Basement Stairs. Caroline Hughes inherited the cabin from an uncle she'd barely known, a recluse named Gerald who died alone in a nursing home in Tennessee. The property was in eastern Kentucky, deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, and Caroline had never visited it. She was a high school teacher from Lexington, 29 years old, struggling with student debt and rent. When the lawyer told her the cabin was hers, free and clear, she saw it as an opportunity. She could move there, teach remotely if possible, or just live cheaply until she figured things out. The cabin was larger than she expected. 2 stories with a wide porch, built solidly from chestnut logs probably a century old. The property included 15 acres of forested land. It needed work. The roof leaked. The plumbing was questionable, but it was livable. Caroline moved in during August, spending her days cleaning, repairing, and exploring her unexpected inheritance. The basement was accessible through a door in the kitchen floor, a hatch that opened to reveal steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. Caroline delayed exploring it for the first week. Something about that dark rectangle in the floor made her uncomfortable. When she finally worked up the nerve, she opened the hatch, turned on her flashlight, and climbed. The basement was unexpectedly deep, the stairs going down at least 15 feet. At the bottom was a large space with a dirt floor, stone walls, and support beams holding up the cabin above. It smelled of earth and mildew. Old canning jars lined crude wooden shelves. Rusted tools hung on the walls. In the far corner, Caroline's flashlight beam landed on something that made her pause. A second set of stairs leading down into the floor itself. These stairs were newer than the ones she'd descended, made from fresh lumber that looked out of place in the ancient basement. They disappeared into a dark opening in the dirt floor, going deeper into the earth. Caroline approached cautiously, shining her light down the hole. The stairs descended at least another 10 feet before her beam couldn't penetrate the darkness below. She felt cold air rising from the opening, carrying a smell she couldn't identify, mineral and organic at once, like wet stone and old meat. She backed away and climbed out of the basement, closing the hatch firmly. That night, she researched the property records online using her phone's limited data. The cabin had been built in 1902 by a family named Keller. It had changed hands several times before her uncle purchased it in 1988. Nothing in the records mentioned a sub-basement or any unusual construction. Caroline tried to forget about the stairs. She focused on making the cabin comfortable, on preparing for the school year. But at night, she heard sounds from below, creaking as if someone was climbing stairs, soft thuds like footsteps on dirt. Once, she heard what sounded like dragging, something heavy being pulled across the basement floor. 3 weeks after moving in, Caroline woke at 3 in the morning to find the kitchen hatch standing open. She was certain she'd closed it before bed. She checked it every night, even putting a heavy cast iron skillet on top as a makeshift weight. Now the skillet sat on the counter, and the hatch yawned open, revealing the dark stairs below. Cold air flowed up from the opening, carrying that strange smell stronger than before. Caroline grabbed a knife and her flashlight. She wanted to simply close the hatch and go back to bed, but something stopped her. If something had opened it from below, she needed to know what. She descended the basement stairs slowly, every sense alert. The basement looked as it had before, but the smell was overwhelming now. She crossed to the second set of stairs and shone her light down. The stairs now went much deeper. They seemed to have extended, descending far past where they'd ended before. Caroline could see at least 30 now, all identical, all disappearing into darkness below. That wasn't possible. She'd been down here 3 weeks ago. Stairs don't grow, she should have left. She should have climbed back up, locked the hatch, packed her things, and left that very night. Instead, she descended the second staircase. She told herself later that it felt like compulsion, like something was pulling her down. But in truthful moments, she admits it was curiosity. She needed to know what was down there. The stairs went down for much longer than was physically possible. Caroline counted 60 steps, then 80, then lost count. The temperature dropped with each step. The smell grew stronger. The walls changed from stone to dirt to something else, a smooth, dark surface that her flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by rather than reflected. Finally, after what felt like descending hundreds of feet, she reached the bottom. She stood in a large chamber that couldn't possibly exist beneath her cabin. The space was vast, the walls curving away beyond her light's reach. The floor was covered in a layer of something black and viscous that moved slowly, like oil but thicker. And throughout the chamber, scattered across the floor and half submerged in the black substance, were bones. Human bones. Dozens of skeletons, maybe hundreds, all arranged in a pattern she couldn't comprehend. They formed symbols, shapes, a design that hurt to look at. In the center of the chamber, the bones formed a spiral leading to a pit. The pit was deeper still, going down into absolute darkness, and from it came a sound, breathing. Slow, rhythmic, massive. Something down there in the impossible depth was breathing. Something huge. Caroline ran. She scrambled back up the stairs, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The breathing behind her grew louder, faster, excited. She could hear something else now, movement in the chamber below. A rustling, shifting sound as if all those bones were assembling themselves, coming together into something that could follow her up the stairs. She reached the basement and kept running, taking the stairs to the kitchen 2 at a time. She slammed the hatch shut and dragged the refrigerator over it. For the rest of the night, she sat in her car in the driveway, engine running, watching the cabin. As dawn broke, she saw the kitchen window from outside. The hatch was open again. The refrigerator somehow moved aside, and standing at the kitchen window looking out at her was a figure made entirely of bones. It didn't have eyes, but she could feel it watching her. Then it turned and descended back into the hatch, the bones clattering as it moved. Caroline drove to town and went straight to the Historical Society, demanding to know the cabin's. The elderly woman who ran it, Martha Calloway, went pale when Caroline described what she'd found. Martha pulled out old newspaper clippings from the 1920s. The Keller family who'd built the cabin had been arrested in 1923 for murder. Multiple travelers who'd gone missing in the area over 2 decades were eventually traced back to the Keller property. The investigation revealed that the family had been part of a cult that believed the mountains were hollow, that ancient gods slept in the depths, and that feeding them would grant eternal life. The Kellers had built the second staircase, digging deeper and deeper into the earth, throwing bodies down into the darkness as offerings. The patriarch, Jeremiah Keller, confessed before being hanged, claiming that something spoke to him from below, promising him power. The authorities found the basement stairs but reported they only went down about 10 feet before hitting bedrock. They sealed it with concrete. "But your uncle," Martha said quietly, "he was obsessed with the property. He spent 30 years here alone. If he removed that concrete, if he kept digging." She didn't finish the sentence. Caroline never went back. She signed the property over to the state, refusing any money for it. The state sent investigators who found the basement and the first set of stairs, but they reported that the second staircase only descended about 5 feet before ending in a dirt wall. They found no evidence of any chamber, no bones, nothing unusual. They concluded Caroline had experienced a mental breakdown, but Caroline knows what she saw, and she knows that her uncle didn't die of old age in that nursing home. She visited his medical records, using her status as next of kin. The doctors couldn't explain his condition. His bones were deteriorating, becoming soft and crumbly, as if something was slowly absorbing them from inside. In his final days, he kept talking about going home, about descending the stairs one last time, about feeding the thing in the pit so it would finally let him rest. Caroline moved to Colorado, as far from the Appalachian mountains as she could afford. She lives on the 10th floor of an apartment building, surrounded by neighbors with no basement. But sometimes at night she hears it, the creak of wooden stairs beneath her floor. She tells herself it's the building settling, the neighbors, the pipes. But she's measured her apartment carefully. The ceiling height, the floor thickness. The math doesn't work. There's extra space beneath her floor that shouldn't be there. Space that's growing, expanding downward as if something is digging up toward her from below. She's put a request at her school. She wants to move again, maybe to a place with no basement, no lower floors at all. But she's starting to accept the truth. When she descended those stairs, when she looked into that pit and heard that breathing, something looked back. Something noticed her, and it's been following her ever since, slowly, patiently, digging through the earth itself to reach her. One day, she knows, she'll wake up to find a hatch in her floor, and when she opens it, the stairs will be waiting, leading down to where the patient thing has been preparing a place for her among the bones in the dark. Story 4. The Mirror Man. David Castellanos needed to disappear for a while, and a friend's cabin in the mountains of northern Georgia seemed like the perfect solution. At 36, he was a journalist who'd published an investigative piece that made powerful people angry. He'd received threats, credible ones. His editor suggested he take a month off, go somewhere remote, let things cool down. The cabin was outside Elijah, accessible only by a winding dirt road. No neighbors for miles, no internet, barely any cell signal. David arrived in late September with a laptop, a stack of books, and enough supplies for a month. The cabin was small but well-appointed, clearly someone's passion project. Wide windows, polished wood floors, a stone fireplace, and mirrors, an unusual number of mirrors. They hung on most walls, reflecting the interior space and making the cabin feel larger than it was. David found it slightly disorienting at first, catching glimpses of his reflection from multiple angles, but he adjusted. The first week passed uneventfully. David wrote, read, hiked the surrounding woods, and enjoyed the profound quiet. He video called his girlfriend twice from a spot up the road where he could get signal. He felt the tension of the previous months beginning to ease. On the 8th night, he noticed something odd. He was brushing his teeth in the bathroom, looking at himself in the mirror when his reflection blinked, but he hadn't blinked. He paused, staring at himself. It didn't happen again. He convinced himself he'd imagined it, his own blink misperceived in his tired state. The next morning, David walked past the large mirror in the living room and stopped. His reflection was there, as expected, but something felt wrong. He stepped closer, examining his reflection carefully. It looked exactly like him, moved when he moved, matched him perfectly. But the eyes, something about the eyes was off. They looked at him with an expression he wasn't making, an intensity he didn't feel. He blinked hard, shook his head, and the impression vanished. The reflection was normal again. days, the oddities increased. David would catch movements in mirrors that didn't match his own. His reflection would turn its head just slightly before he turned his. He'd see it smile when his face was neutral. Once, late at night, he walked past a mirror in the dark and could swear his reflection was illuminated, as if light was hitting it from a different angle than the actual room. David started covering the mirrors with sheets and towels. He told himself he was being paranoid, that isolation was affecting him, but covering the mirrors brought immediate relief. With them covered, the cabin felt safe again. He went 3 days seeing no reflections of himself, and his nerves settled. On the 11th night, David woke at 2 in the morning to find every mirror uncovered. The sheets and towels were folded neatly on the couch, as if someone had carefully removed them while he slept. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, and looked at the mirror hanging directly across from his bed. In the dim moonlight coming through the window, he could see his reflection clearly. It was sitting up in bed, matching his position. But as David watched, frozen in fear, his reflection smiled. A slow, wide smile that David wasn't making. Then it spoke. David's own voice came from the mirror, slightly muffled, like someone speaking through glass. "You've been hiding from me." The reflection's mouth moved, but David's didn't. "That's rude. I'm you after all. We should get to know each other better." David screamed and threw a lamp at the mirror. It shattered, glass exploding across the room. In the broken shards, he could see himself fractured into dozens of pieces, each piece showing a different expression: smiling, frowning, angry, laughing, crying. All the faces he could make, displayed simultaneously, none of them matching what he actually felt. He spent the rest of the night in his car, headlights pointed at the cabin, unable to drive away in the dark on the treacherous mountain road. At first light, he went back inside to grab his essentials and leave. In the living room, he stopped cold. The large mirror on the wall, the one he'd covered first, was now uncovered. Standing in the reflection, looking out at him from inside the mirror, was himself. But this version of David was different. Its clothes were slightly wrong, its hair styled differently, its posture more confident. It stood in a room that looked like the cabin but wasn't quite right. The furniture was arranged differently. The windows showed darkness when the real windows showed daylight. Mirror David raised a hand and placed it flat against the glass from inside. "You can't leave," it said with David's voice. "I need you to understand something. I've been here for a long time, in all of these mirrors. Every reflection you've ever seen of yourself. I was there, watching, learning, becoming you. I know you better than you know yourself. I've watched you at your worst, seen every flaw you hide from the world, and now I'm strong enough to swap places." "That's insane," David said, his voice shaking. "You're not real, you're just a reflection." "Am I?" Mirror David tilted its head. "How do you know you're not the reflection? How do you know you weren't always inside the glass, just convinced otherwise? Maybe I'm the real David, and you're the copy who's about to be erased." David ran from the cabin, not bothering to pack, leaving everything behind. He drove down the mountain road too fast, nearly crashing twice. When he reached town and stopped at a gas station, he avoided looking at any reflective surfaces. He used the bathroom but kept his eyes on the floor. While washing his hands, he couldn't help it. He glanced up at the mirror. Mirror David stood behind him. Not beside him, behind him, even though the real David stood alone. Mirror David placed its hands on real David's shoulders from inside the glass. David felt nothing on his physical shoulders, but in the mirror he saw the hands gripping tight. "I'm coming through," Mirror David said. "Soon. You'll feel it when it happens. You'll feel yourself getting lighter, less solid, more transparent. And one day you'll reach out to touch something and your hand will pass right through it. That's when you'll realize you've become the reflection. That's when you'll understand you're on the wrong side of the glass." David smashed the bathroom mirror with his elbow, setting off the gas station's alarm. The police came, an ambulance. David tried to explain but couldn't make it coherent. They took him to a hospital in Appalachia. The psychiatric evaluation found him stressed but not committable. They released him with a referral for therapy. He went back to Atlanta, back to his life. He tried to move on. But he couldn't escape mirrors. They're everywhere. Every bathroom, every store, every car. And in every reflection, Mirror David was there, sometimes in the background, sometimes standing right behind him, always watching, always getting closer. David started noticing that his reflection moved with a slight delay, just a fraction of a second. When he reached for something, his reflection's hand moved a moment after his real hand. The delay grew each day, half a second, then a full second, then two. Last week, David reached for his coffee cup at a diner. His hand knocked it over, but in the mirror behind the counter, his reflection's hand hadn't moved yet. It was still reaching, still in motion, while his real hand was pulling back from the spilled coffee. For 2 full seconds, his reflection did independently. The waitress didn't notice. No one ever notices. David knows what's happening. The transfer is occurring bit by bit. He's becoming the reflection while Mirror David solidifies into reality. He's losing his substance, his reality, being pulled into the glass. He's tried destroying mirrors, but that just fractures him into more pieces. He's tried avoiding them, but they're impossible to escape. Even now, as he types this account on his laptop, he can see his faint reflection in the screen. And that reflection is smiling, waving at him, mouthing words. Almost time to switch. Almost time to come home. He's starting to see through his own hands when the light hits them right. He's starting to feel thin, like paper, like something that could tear. And in every mirror he passes, Mirror David looks more solid, more real, more present. David knows that one day very soon, he'll look in a mirror and see Mirror David looking out from the real world, living his life, while David is trapped inside the glass, watching, unable to escape, becoming just another reflection for someone else to see and ignore. The worst part is that Mirror David knows everything about his life, everyone he loves, every password, every secret. No one will know the switch happened. Everyone will think Mirror David is the real David, and the real David will be forgotten inside the mirror, just another reflection that people glance at without seeing, trapped forever on the wrong side of the glass. Story 5. The Thing in the Well. Rebecca Thornton's sabbatical was supposed to be about finishing her doctoral dissertation in folklore studies. At 34, she'd been working on her PhD for 6 years, teaching part-time at a university in Pennsylvania while researching Appalachian folk beliefs. When she found the cabin for rent outside Gatlinburg, Tennessee, it seemed ideal, isolated, affordable, and located in the heart of the region she was studying. The cabin sat on 40 acres at the end of a hollow, surrounded by old-growth forest, with a mountain stream running through the property. Rebecca moved in during April, planning to stay through September. The cabin was charming, built in the 1940s, maintained but not modernized, with wide plank floors and a covered porch. The property included an old stone well about 50 yards from the cabin, covered by a wooden cap and ringed by stacked rocks. According to the owner, the well hadn't been used in decades. The cabin now had a modern well and electric pump, but it was a historical feature they'd preserved. For the first month, Rebecca felt a comfortable routine. She interviewed locals about folk beliefs, recorded stories, and spent long hours writing. She found the isolation productive, though she occasionally felt watched. She attributed this to the forest itself, the density of trees, the way sound carried oddly in the hollow, the wildlife. She'd see deer frequently, hear turkeys in the pre-dawn, and sometimes glimpse larger shadows that might have been black bears. In late May, Rebecca noticed something strange about the well. She'd walked past it hundreds of times, barely glancing at it, but one morning the wooden cap was askew, shifted several feet to the side. She approached carefully and peered down. The well was deep. Her phone's flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. The stone walls disappeared into absolute darkness. The air rising from it was cold and smelled of minerals and something else, something organic and unpleasant. Rebecca made a note to tell the owner about the displaced cap and went back to her work. That night, she heard sounds outside, scraping like wood dragging across stone. In the morning, the well cap was completely removed, lying on the ground 10 feet away. Rebecca felt uneasy but tried to rationalize it. An animal, maybe a bear, could have moved it. She took photos and called the owner, leaving a message about securing the well properly. The next few nights were disturbed by sounds, splashing from the direction of the well as if something was moving in water. Wet, slapping sounds like footsteps on stone. And once, late at night, something that sounded like breathing, deep, labored, resonant. Rebecca told herself it was her imagination amplifying normal forest sounds. But she started keeping her doors and windows locked at night, something she hadn't bothered with before. 1 week after the cap was first moved, Rebecca woke at 3 in the morning to find wet footprints on her porch. They led from the direction of the well to her front door, where they stopped. The prints were roughly human-shaped but wrong, too long, too narrow, with 6 toes instead of 5. The depth of the prints suggested incredible weight. They glistened in her flashlight beam, and when she touched one, the moisture was ice cold and left a gray residue on her fingers that smelled like rotten eggs. Rebecca drove to town at first light and went to the local library, searching historical records about her property. What she found chilled her. In 1952, a family named Sutton had lived in the cabin. Their 12-year-old daughter, Emily, had fallen into the well and drowned. The well was over 80 feet deep, and the recovery of her body took 3 days. But according to paper reports, when they finally brought Emily up, the recovery team reported strange details. Her body was positioned oddly, as if she'd been standing upright at the bottom rather than floating. Her hands were palm up, fingers curled as if holding something. And her eyes were open, staring upward, but the corneas had turned completely black. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, but several of the recovery team members refused to go near the property again. One man, quoted anonymously, said, "There's something at the bottom of that well, something old. We heard it moving around down there. Emily wasn't alone when we found her." After Emily's death, the Sutton family sealed the well and moved away. The property changed hands several times. In 1967, a hunter renting the cabin reported seeing a girl in a wet dress standing by the well at night. In 1983, a couple staying there heard splashing and found their dog dead beside the well, drowned somehow despite the well being covered, and the dog being too small to move the heavy wooden cap. Rebecca returned to the cabin, now deeply frightened but also fascinated from a researcher's perspective. This was exactly the kind of folk horror she studied. That night she set up her camera on a tripod facing the well, recording continuously. She watched from her window, lights off, determined to document whatever was happening. Around midnight she heard the splashing again. Through her window, using binoculars, she saw movement at the well. Something was climbing out. It moved slowly, deliberately, pulling itself up the stone walls with wet, slapping sounds. Rebecca's breath caught. The thing that emerged wasn't human, though it had roughly human proportions. It was emaciated, impossibly thin, its skin gray and slick. Its limbs were too long, jointed in too many places. Its head was hairless and elongated, and even at a distance Rebecca could see its eyes, completely black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. But it wore clothes. The rotted, disintegrating remains of a dress that might once have been white. Emily's dress, Rebecca realized with horror. But this wasn't Emily. This was something else, something that had been in that well long before Emily fell in. Something that had taken her body, animated it, transformed it into something that could climb up from the depths whenever it chose. The creature moved toward the cabin. Rebecca ducked below the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She heard wet footsteps on the porch, then silence. Then scratching at the door, not knocking but scratching like nails on wood. And a voice, childlike but wrong, spoken through vocal cords that had rotted decades ago. "Let me in. I'm cold. I've been in the water so long. Please let me in. I need to get warm. I need to get dry, please." Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, not breathing, praying the door would hold. The scratching continued for hours. The voice alternated between pleading and angry. "I know you're in there. I can smell you. I can hear your heart beating. Let me in. Let me in." At dawn, it stopped. Rebecca waited until full daylight before looking outside. The porch was covered in wet footprints and gray slime. The well cap was back in place, perfectly positioned. Her camera had run all night. With shaking hands, she reviewed the footage. The video showed everything: the thing climbing from the well, approaching the cabin, standing at the door. But worse, it showed what happened at dawn. The creature had returned to the well, climbing down into the depths. But before it descended completely, it had paused, looked directly at the camera, and smiled. Not with Emily's face. The face in the video was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent that wore Emily's corpse like a suit. And in that smile was recognition. It knew Rebecca had recorded it. It knew she'd seen. And it was pleased. Rebecca left that morning, abandoning most of her belongings, breaking her lease without explanation. She returned to Pennsylvania and tried to resume her life, but she couldn't. She kept thinking about the well, about what lived at the bottom, about all the wells scattered through Appalachia, some covered, some forgotten, some still in use. How many contained something other than water? She made the mistake of researching it. She found reports scattered across decades, across multiple states: Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee. Stories of wells where children fell in and drowned, their bodies recovered in strange positions. Stories of things that climbed out at night. Stories of voices calling from the darkness below, begging to be let in. The pattern was clear once you looked for it. Something ancient lived in the deep places, in the aquifers and underground rivers of the Appalachian Mountains. Something that waited at the bottoms of wells, patient and eternal, for someone to fall in. And when they did, it kept them, transformed them, used them as vessels to climb up into the world above. Rebecca's dissertation changed focus. She's now documenting well-related folklore, compiling a database of incidents, trying to find the pattern, the origin. Her advisors think she's lost perspective, become too obsessed with a single folkloric motif. But Rebecca knows the truth. She's seen it. She's recorded. She's never shown anyone the video. She watches it sometimes, late at night, studying the thing's face, trying to understand what it is, what it wants, where it came from. And sometimes when she's in the shower or washing her hands, she hears it, that childlike voice echoing up through the drain pipes from somewhere deep below. "I'm still cold. I'm still in the water. Come help me. Come down here and help me get warm." Rebecca has stopped using water when she can help it. She's looking for an apartment with no basement, no well, no connection to the aquifer. But she's starting to realize that it doesn't matter. Water flows everywhere, connecting everything underground. And somewhere in that vast network of darkness, the thing that wears Emily is looking for her, following the water, climbing up through the pipes, getting closer every day. Rebecca knows that eventually she'll turn on a faucet, and instead of water, something else will pour out. Something cold and gray and impossibly thin, unfolding itself from the pipe, smiling with a face that isn't Emily's anymore, whispering, "You saw me. You recorded me. Now I've found you, and I'm so very, very cold." Story 6. The Family Photographs. Thomas Brenner bought the cabin in late autumn as an investment property. At 45, he'd made decent money in real estate back in Charlotte, North Carolina, and was looking for vacation rentals to diversify his portfolio. The cabin was located outside Banner Elk, North Carolina in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the price was suspiciously low. When Thomas asked why, the selling agent became evasive, mentioning only that the previous owner had left suddenly and the estate wanted a quick sale. Thomas, seeing an opportunity, purchased it without even visiting the property first. He drove up to inspect his purchase in November, planning to spend a few days assessing what repairs and updates were needed before listing it as a rental. The cabin was isolated, accessible by a rough gravel road that wound through dense forest, surrounded by towering hemlocks and oaks. It was a large structure, bigger than he'd expected from the photos. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, clearly built for a big family. The architecture was old, probably 1920s, with hand-hewn beams and stone fireplaces in both the living room and master bedroom. The interior was fully furnished, which was unusual. Most estate sales liquidated furnishings separately, but everything was there: beds, tables, dishes, even personal items like books and lamps. It was as if the previous owners had simply walked out one return. Thomas made notes as he walked through, planning renovations. The place needed cosmetic work but was structurally sound. In the master bedroom, Thomas noticed the photographs. They covered an entire wall, dozens of framed family photos spanning what appeared to be several generations. Black and white photos from the early 1900s gradually transitioned to color photos from the 60s, 70s, 80s. All showed the same location, this cabin. Different families, different eras, but always this property, these rooms, these views. Thomas found it oddly unsettling but figured they added rustic charm. He'd leave them up for rental guests. That first night, Thomas stayed in the cabin to get a feel for it. He made dinner from supplies he'd brought, read by the fire, and went to bed around 11. He woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of voices downstairs. Multiple voices, talking and laughing, the sounds of a family gathering. Thomas sat up, heart racing. Had someone broken in? He grabbed his phone, no signal as expected in this location, and crept to the bedroom door. The sounds were clearer in the hallway. Conversation, clinking dishes, a child laughing. Light flickered from downstairs, warm and yellow like firelight. Thomas descended the stairs slowly, leading with his phone's flashlight. As he reached the main floor, the sound stopped abruptly. The house was dark and silent. No one was there. The fireplace was cold, the dishes undisturbed in the cabinets. Thomas convinced himself he'd been dreaming, or perhaps the sounds had carried from outside, though there were no neighbors for miles. He went back to bed but slept poorly, waking several more times with the feeling that he wasn't alone. In the morning, Thomas examined the house more carefully. In the living room, he noticed something odd about one of the photographs. It showed a family of 5 parents and 3 children standing on the cabin's porch. The photo appeared to be from the 1960s based on the clothing and color quality. But the faces were wrong. They were blurred, smeared, as if the subjects had moved during the exposure. But only the faces were blurred. The bodies and background were perfectly clear. Thomas checked other photographs. Several had the same problem, faces blurred into indistinct smears while everything else remained sharp. Why would anyone frame and display such flawed photographs? He took one down to examine it closer and noticed something that made his skin crawl. Behind the blurred faces, beneath the smear, he could see hints of expressions that didn't match the apparent mood of the photo. It was a family portrait, everyone presumably smiling for the camera. But beneath the blur, the expressions looked wrong. Mouths open too wide, eyes turned in directions that shouldn't be possible. Over the next 2 days, Thomas tried to focus on his assessment and renovation plans, but the cabin increasingly disturbed him. He'd find photographs he was certain he'd removed back on the walls. He'd hear sounds at night, footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing, always the sounds of a house filled with people despite his solitude. And the photographs were changing. He was sure of it. Images he'd studied carefully would be different when he looked again. A child who'd been standing on the left would now be on the right. A dog that hadn't been in the photo before would appear in the corner. Blurred faces would shift, the smears forming different patterns. On the 3rd night, Thomas woke to find someone standing at the foot of his bed. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face a smeared blur where her features should be. She stood perfectly still, watching him. Thomas screamed and scrambled backward, but his back hit the headboard. There was nowhere to go. The woman tilted her head, the blur where her face should be rippling like water. Then she raised one hand and pointed at the wall of photographs behind Thomas. He turned to look. Every photo on the wall now showed the same image. This bedroom, this bed, and Thomas lying in it asleep. Each photo was from a slightly different angle, as if taken from various positions around the room. But in several of the photos, there were other figures in the room with sleeping Thomas. Blurred figures standing around the bed, leaning close, reaching toward him with indistinct hands. When Thomas turned back, the woman was gone. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. At dawn, he packed his bag and left, planning to return to Charlotte and sell the property immediately, regardless of the loss. But as he drove down the mountain road, he checked his rearview mirror and saw something that made him nearly crash. In the backseat of his car, barely visible in the early light, was a child, one of the children from the photographs. Blurred face, old-fashioned clothes, sitting perfectly still, watching him. Thomas pulled over, jumped out of the car, and looked in the back seat. Empty. Nothing there. He got back in and drove, checking the mirror constantly. The child appeared and disappeared, sometimes there, sometimes not, always watching with that faceless blur. When Thomas reached Charlotte, he went straight to a local historian who specialized in Appalachian history. He told her everything and showed her photos he'd taken of the cabin. The historian, Dr. Ellen Marsh, recognized the property immediately. She pulled out files from her archives and told Thomas the cabin's history. The property had been built in 1923 by a family named Pritchard. They lived there for 5 years before vanishing in 1928. Authorities found the cabin fully furnished, food on the table, but no sign of the family. They were never found. In 1930, another family moved in, the Colemans. They lasted 3 years before they too disappeared under similar circumstances. This pattern repeated 6 times over the next 70 years. Families would move in, stay for a few years, then vanish completely, always leaving everything behind, always without explanation. The last family, the Torrances, disappeared in 2015. According to Dr. Marsh, there were rumors. Locals spoke of the cabin being hungry, of it collecting families somehow. Several investigators had examined the property over the decades but found nothing unusual. The case remained unsolved. The property would stay empty for a few years, then someone would buy it, and the cycle would begin again. "You're lucky you weren't there longer," Dr. Marsh said. The pattern suggests it takes time, months, maybe a year. The families who disappeared had all lived there for at least 2 years. Whatever is happening, it's slow. But once it starts, once the cabin notices you, I don't think you can leave. Thomas sold the property for a fraction of what he paid, disclosing nothing to the new buyers. He told himself it was their problem now, that he'd escaped. But he knew it wasn't over. The photographs in his car, the ones he'd taken with his phone as documentation, were changing. Each day he'd look at them and see new details. His own reflection appearing in mirrors within the photos, blurred figures standing closer to the camera. And in the most recent check, he saw himself in one of the photos, not Thomas taking the picture, but Thomas in the photograph itself, standing with the other blurred figures, his face beginning to smear and blur at the edges. Thomas has tried deleting the photos, but they reappear. He's tried destroying his phone, but the images transfer to his computer, his tablet, any screen he looks at. And now when he looks at his actual photographs, recent ones, taken after leaving the cabin, he sees changes. His face in the images is starting to blur, just at the edges at first, but spreading gradually inward. His features are becoming indistinct, smeared like all those other faces in the cabin's photographs. He started noticing gaps in his hours he can't account for. He'll be at work and suddenly realize it's 3 hours later with no recollection of the time passing. His colleagues have commented that he seems distant, distracted, not quite present. His girlfriend says sometimes when she looks at him, his face seems to flicker, becoming briefly unclear before solidifying again. Thomas knows what's happening. The cabin collected him after all. Distance doesn't matter. The collection process started the moment he spent that first night there, and now it's progressing regardless of where he physically is. He's being pulled into the photographs, into the cabin's memory, becoming one of the blurred figures that will stand in the background of images, watching future visitors, warning them in the only way the cabin's prisoners can, by appearing, by making their presence known, by trying desperately to manifest clearly enough to be seen as the threat they represent. He's writing this account while he still can, while his thoughts are still his own and clear. He's noticing that his handwriting is becoming shaky, imprecise, blurred. When he types, the letters on the screen sometimes smear before solidifying. He's disappearing into the blur, becoming a photograph himself, trapped in the cabin's collection of memories. And someday soon, another person will buy that cabin, will walk through those rooms, will notice the photographs on the wall, and will see Thomas among them. A blurred figure in the background, face smeared beyond recognition, standing with all the other collected families, warning and threatening and pleading all at once, another prisoner in the cabin's endless exhibition of the disappeared. Story 7. The Creek Keeps Rising. Martin Sawyer retired at 62 and bought a cabin in the mountains of southwest Virginia, near the town of Damascus. After 40 years as an accountant in Richmond, he craved simplicity, fishing, hiking, reading on the porch. The cabin sat alongside White-Top Laurel Creek, a beautiful mountain stream that ran crystal clear over smooth stones. The sound of flowing water was constant and soothing. Martin moved in during June, planning to live there permanently. The cabin's previous owner, an old man named Horace Kemp, had died of a heart attack at 89. His family sold the property fully furnished at a fair price. During the closing, Horace's daughter mentioned casually that her father had been obsessed with the creek's water level. He'd measured it daily, kept detailed logs, and became agitated during rain events. She attributed this to old age eccentricity, assured Martin the property had never flooded. Martin found this charming rather than concerning. The creek was lovely, about 20 feet wide, running shallow most of the time, perhaps 2 feet deep at its deepest point during normal conditions. The cabin sat on a small rise about 30 yards from the water's edge, well above any reasonable flood stage. Martin spent his first weeks settling in, organizing the cabin, and beginning his retirement routine. He found Horace's logs in a desk drawer, decades of daily measurements of the creek's depth and width, recorded meticulously in small notebooks. The entries went back to 1987, when Horace had first bought the property. For the first several years, the measurements were mundane, showing normal seasonal variation, higher in spring, lower in late summer, rising during rains. But starting in 1994, the tone of the entries changed. Horace began adding comments. Creek rose 6 inches overnight. No rain. Water moving faster than it should be. Wrong color today, too dark. Martin found this odd but not alarming. The measurements themselves seemed normal, even if Horace's commentary became increasingly paranoid. The final entries from just before Horace's death were nearly illegible, the handwriting shaky. It's getting closer. Rises every year. Measured from porch today, 28 yards, 6 inches. 20 years ago, it was 42 yards. It's coming for the cabin. It's coming for me. Martin checked the measurement himself. From the porch to the water's edge was exactly 28 yards and 6 inches. He did the math based on Horace's historical records. If the numbers were accurate, the creek had been gradually, almost imperceptibly, moving closer to the cabin, only a foot or two per year, but consistent, relentless. Over 30-plus years, that added up. Martin wondered if erosion was eating away at the bank, but when he examined the creek edge, he found healthy vegetation and stable soil. No sign of erosion. He decided to humor Horace's obsession by keeping his own log. He measured the distance from porch to water daily, recording it each morning. For the first month, the measurement stayed constant at 28 yards, 6 inches. Martin felt relieved. Horace had been paranoid, seeing patterns that didn't exist. Then in late July, after 3 days of heavy rain, Martin measured the distance at 28 yards, 3 inches. 3 inches closer. He attributed it to the creek running high from the rain, but when he measured the actual water level, it had returned to normal. The creek hadn't risen, moved. Or rather, the water had moved, creeping 3 inches closer to the cabin. Over the next weeks, Martin became obsessed with the measurements. Rain or shine, the creek moved closer, slowly, irregularly, but undeniably. An inch some weeks, nothing for a while, then 2 inches all at once. By late August, it was 27 yards, 11 inches. Martin started taking multiple measurements per day, checking morning, noon, and night. He noticed other oddities. The sound of the creek was getting louder, though the volume of water hadn't increased. At night, lying in bed, the rushing water sounded as if it was right outside his window instead of nearly 30 yards away. He'd wake up disoriented, convinced he was sleeping beside the creek itself. And the water's color was indeed changing. It had a darker tint now, a slight opacity that hadn't been there before, as if something was dissolving into it. Martin drove to the Damascus Town Library and researched the property's history. What he found disturbed him. Before Horace, the cabin had been owned by a woman named Irene Blackwell, who'd lived there from 1972 to 1986. She died in the cabin, drowned, according to the death certificate. But the circumstances were strange. Irene had been found in her bed, soaked with water, her lungs full of it, as if she drowned in her sleep despite being nowhere near the creek. Investigators ruled it an unexplained death, possibly related to some rare medical condition. Before Irene, the cabin had belonged to a family named Dillard. They'd abandoned it suddenly in 1971 after living there only 6 months. Local rumors, mentioned briefly in a newspaper article Martin found, suggested the Dillards claimed the creek was coming for them, that it rose at night, that they'd wake to find water pooling on the cabin floor despite no visible leaks or rain. Martin returned to the cabin as evening fell. He measured again, 27 yards, 8 inches. 3 inches closer in the 8 hours he'd been gone. That night he barely slept, listening to the creek's roar. It definitely sounded louder, closer. Around 3 in the morning, he heard something that made him sit upright, splashing as if something large was moving through the water. He grabbed his flashlight and went to the window. The creek was where it should be, nearly 30 yards away. But in his flashlight beam, Martin saw the water's surface moving unnaturally. It was flowing toward the cabin. Not downstream in the normal direction, but flowing perpendicularly to its channel. A tongue of water extending across the grass, reaching for the cabin like a finger. As Martin watched in horror, the water advanced another few inches, then stopped, as if testing, exploring, confirming its route. Martin spent the rest of the night in his car, parked up the road. At dawn, he returned to find the grass between creek and cabin wet with dew or perhaps something else. He measured 27 yards, 5 inches, 3 more inches overnight. At this rate, the water would reach the cabin in about a year, but Martin was certain it would accelerate. He read through all of Horace's logs again and found the pattern. The closer the creek got, the faster it moved. In Horace's final year, he'd recorded movements of 6 inches per week. Martin should have left, he knew that. But something kept him there, a need to understand, to document, to confirm what was happening. He set up cameras around the property, recording continuously. He took hourly measurements. He watched the footage each morning, and what he saw defied explanation. The water did move, not quickly, not in a flood, but slowly, deliberately, like something alive and patient. It spread across the ground in thin sheets, advancing toward the cabin, retreating before dawn as if hiding its progress, but never retreating quite as far as it had been, always gaining ground. By mid-September, the creek was 25 yards from the cabin. Martin could hear it constantly now, a rushing that filled his ears even when he was inside with windows closed. The sound invaded his thoughts. He'd be reading or cooking and realize he hadn't heard anything but the water for hours. His clothes felt damp constantly. The cabin's interior began showing signs of moisture, mildew on the walls, condensation on windows, a persistent wet smell. Martin measured one morning in late September and found the creek at 23 yards. It had jumped 2 yards overnight. He checked his cameras. The footage showed the water rising slowly through the night, spreading across the ground, pooling, advancing. But it didn't look like flooding. It looked like something reaching, extending, growing toward the cabin with purpose. On October 1st, Martin woke to find water on the floor. Not much, just puddles here and there soaking into the wood. He measured outside. 22 yards. The water was seeping into the cabin somehow, finding ways in that shouldn't exist, defying gravity and structure. Martin packed his essentials and decided to leave that day. But when he tried to drive away, his car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if flooded. Martin opened the hood and found the engine bay wet, water pooled in places water shouldn't be able to reach. The road to get cell signal and call for help, but after a mile he found the road ahead washed out. A section about 20 feet wide had collapsed, though there'd been no rain for days. The creek had somehow undermined the road, cutting off the only vehicle access. Martin walked back to the cabin, his mind racing through options. He could hike out through the forest, though it would take hours over rough terrain. But part of him knew that wouldn't work either. The creek would find a way to stop him. It had come this far, it wouldn't let him escape now. That night, Martin didn't sleep. He sat in a chair facing the door, watching water seep in under the threshold, pooling on the floor, rising slowly. The sound of the creek was deafening now, as if he was sitting in the middle of it. He looked out the window and saw the creek had reached the cabin. The water lapped at the porch steps, rising slowly. But beyond it, the creek's original channel still flowed in the distance. The water had extended itself, reaching out while maintaining its original position. Martin understood then what was happening. This wasn't a flood. The creek was alive somehow, or something lived in the creek, something that had been slowly reaching toward the cabin for decades, patient and inevitable. It had taken Irene in her sleep, drowned her in her own bed. It had driven the Dillards away. Horace had managed to hold it off through sheer stubborn observation and measurement, as if witnessing it slowed its progress. But Horace's death had released whatever constraint that created, and now it was accelerating, making up for lost time. The water reached Martin's ankles as he sat there. It was cold, much colder than creek water should be, and it didn't move like normal water. It climbed up his legs, defying gravity, wrapping around him like something with intent. Martin tried to stand to reach the door, but the water was faster. It was at his waist, his chest, his neck. He opened his mouth to scream, and the water poured in, filling his lungs with that impossible cold. They found Martin Sawyer 3 weeks later when a hiker noticed his abandoned car. He was in his bed, soaked through, his lungs full of water, drowned in the same inexplicable way Irene Blackwell had drowned. The cabin floor was wet, and there was water damage throughout, but no evidence of flooding. The creek was exactly where it had always been, running clear and beautiful over smooth stones, 28 yards and 6 inches from the porch, exactly where it had been when Martin first measured it, as if it had retreated to its starting point, satisfied, ready to wait patiently for the next occupant. The property is for sale again now. The price is very reasonable. The listing mentions the creek, the soothing sound of flowing water. If you buy it, you'll probably find Martin's logs in the desk drawer along with Horace's. You might decide to keep measuring to track the creek's progress to see if the pattern holds. And if you do, I hope you're smarter than Martin was. I hope you leave the moment the water starts moving closer. Because the creek is patient and it's always hungry, and once it starts coming for you, there's nowhere you can go that water can't reach. Story 8. The Recordings. Ethan Price was a sound engineer and podcast producer from Philadelphia who rented the cabin in eastern Tennessee for 2 months to work on a documentary project about Appalachian oral histories. At 28, he'd built a decent career recording interviews, stories, and environmental sounds for various productions. The cabin outside Crossville was perfect for his needs, isolated enough for clean recordings, located in a region rich with folklore, and cheap enough to fit his tight budget. The cabin was small and simple, just 2 rooms with a sleeping loft, but it had good acoustics. Ethan set up his equipment quickly: microphones, recording interfaces, laptop backup drives. He spent his days driving to nearby towns, interviewing elderly residents about local legends, ghost stories, and folk traditions. Evenings, he'd return to the cabin to review and edit his recordings. Ethan had a professional habit of recording constantly. He'd leave his equipment running even when not actively interviewing, capturing ambient sounds that he'd use for atmosphere in his productions: wind through trees, creek sounds, bird calls, crickets at night. His setup automatically recorded whenever sound exceeded a certain threshold, saving files with timestamps. After a week at the cabin, Ethan was reviewing his ambient recordings and noticed something odd. In several nighttime files, recorded while he'd been sleeping, there were sounds from inside the cabin: footsteps, creaking floorboards, the sound of objects being moved. At first, he assumed he'd been getting up in the night and simply didn't remember, perhaps to use the bathroom or get water. But the sounds were too frequent and too varied. It sounded like someone searching the cabin, opening drawers, moving furniture. Ethan set up a camera along with his audio equipment before bed the next night. In the morning, he reviewed both recordings. The audio had captured the same phenomena: footsteps, drawers opening, objects moving. But the video showed nothing. The cabin remained empty, Ethan visible in the loft sleeping undisturbed, while the audio captured someone or something moving around below him. As a sound engineer, Ethan understood audio in ways most people didn't. He analyzed the recordings carefully, looking for explanations. The footsteps had weight to them, producing floorboard creaks consistent with something heavy moving across the floor. The drawer sounds had the specific acoustic signature of wood sliding on wood. These weren't artifacts or interference. They were real sounds, captured properly, but of events that somehow hadn't visually occurred. Ethan decided to investigate further. He set up multiple microphones throughout the cabin, creating a spatial audio map that would let him pinpoint exactly where sounds originated. That night, the recordings captured something far more disturbing. At 2:43 a.m., all microphones simultaneously recorded a voice. It was speaking clearly, saying, "He's listening, he's recording us. We need to be quieter." Ethan's blood went cold as he listened. The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking in a regional accent. The spatial audio placed the speaker standing directly in the center of the cabin's main room, but the video showed no one there. Ethan watched the video repeatedly, syncing it precisely with the audio. The moment the voice spoke, nothing happened visually. The cabin remained empty and still. Over the following nights, Ethan captured more voices. There were multiple speakers: men, women, children. They had conversations with each other, discussing mundane things: the weather, repairs needed on the cabin, what to have for dinner. They sounded like a family living their daily lives, but they were having these conversations in a cabin where Ethan could see no one existed. Ethan researched the cabin's history at the local library in Crossville. The property records showed the cabin had been built in 1965 by a family named Hendricks. They'd lived there until 1989, when they'd abruptly moved out. The county had seized the property for unpaid taxes in 1992 and sold it at auction. Since then, it had changed hands 6 times, never staying with one owner more than a few years. There was no record of anything unusual: no deaths, no crimes, no reported hauntings. But Ethan found something else. In the town's historical society archives, he discovered a letter written in 1991 by a man named Paul Hendricks, the son of the family who'd built the cabin. The letter was addressed to the Cumberland Mountain Historical Society, offering to family's old home recordings. The Hendricks family had been early adopters of home recording technology, first with a reel-to-reel tape recorder in the late 60s, then with better equipment through the 80s. They'd recorded extensively: family dinners, conversations, children playing, daily life. Paul's letter explained that after his parents died, he couldn't bear to listen to the recordings, but he wanted them preserved as examples of rural Appalachian family life in the late 20th century. Ethan requested access to the recordings. The Historical Society had over 300 hours of audio on various tapes, reels, and cassettes. They'd never been digitized or cataloged properly. Ethan received permission to review them and brought several boxes back to the cabin. As he listened to the Hendricks family recordings, Ethan realized with growing horror that they matched what he was capturing in his own ambient recordings. The voices were identical. The conversations he was recording at night, they were the Hendricks family conversations from decades ago, somehow playing back in the cabin. He heard the mother, Martha Hendricks, discussing recipes. The father, Donald, talking about repairs to the porch. The children playing games. All of it matching perfectly with his nighttime recordings, as if the sounds of their lives had soaked into the cabin itself and were now replaying endlessly. But there was more. As Ethan continued through the archived recordings, he found something that didn't fit. In a recording dated September 1988, Donald Hendricks was recording one of his usual diary entries. He'd made a habit of recording his thoughts each evening. In this entry, Donald mentioned something disturbing. "I heard myself talking today when I know I wasn't speaking. I was alone in the cabin and I heard my own voice from last week's recording, but the tape recorder was off. The cabin is playing back our sounds. Everything we've ever said here, it's all still here, trapped somehow in the walls, in the floor. I hear echoes of conversations from years ago, overlapping, bleeding through. Martha thinks I'm losing my mind, but I know what I'm hearing. We need to leave." The Hendricks family moved out 6 months later. Ethan found the final recording in the collection, dated March 1989, the day before they left. Donald recorded a warning: "To whoever lives here next, stop making sounds, stop speaking, stop recording." The cabin collects it somehow, stores it, and plays it back. At first it's just echoes of your own voice, your own life. But the more sound you add, the worse it gets. We've filled this place with 30 lives and now it won't shut up. We hear ourselves from every year all at once. Our dead parents visiting from old recordings. Our children at every age talking over each other. It's maddening. The only solution is silence. Complete silence. Starve the cabin of sound and maybe eventually the echoes will fade. Ethan sat in the cabin, the recording equipment around him, and realized what he'd done. For 2 months he'd been recording constantly, adding hours and hours of new sounds to the cabin's collection. His interviews, his voice, his footsteps, his breathing, all of it captured, stored somehow in the acoustic properties of the structure, ready to play back. That night Ethan heard himself. His own voice from a conversation he'd had on the phone 3 days ago, played back clearly from empty air. Then his voice from an interview last week. Then himself humming while cooking. The recordings were fragmenting, splicing together, his voice saying things he'd never said, created from bits and pieces of his captured words recombined into new sentences. "I'm trapped here. I can't stop recording. The sound owns me now." Ethan packed his equipment frantically, desperate to leave. But as he carried boxes to his car, he heard the most terrifying thing yet, his own voice from a recording that hadn't happened yet. His voice screaming, his voice pleading for help, his voice sobbing. All time stamped to dates in the future, days and weeks from now. The cabin wasn't just playing back sounds from the past. It was playing back the future, sounds that would occur, sounds that had already been determined and recorded by whatever impossible acoustic phenomenon haunted this place. Ethan drove away that night, abandoning most of his equipment, leaving behind his 2 months of work. He returned to Philadelphia and tried to resume his career, but he was changed. Every recording he made now contained artifacts, fragments of other sounds, voices that shouldn't be there, echoes of conversations from that cabin bleeding into his professional work. His clients complained. His projects were rejected. The cabin's acoustic contamination had infected his equipment somehow, or perhaps infected him, making him unable to record cleanly ever again. Worse, Ethan still hears his own voice. In quiet moments, he catches fragments of himself speaking words he doesn't remember saying, or hasn't said yet. The recordings from the future that the cabin played, they're still happening. He's living through them now, finding himself in situations that match those fragmented future sounds. Last week, he screamed exactly as the recording predicted. Yesterday, the same sobs he'd heard played back months ago. He's becoming a prisoner of a recording that already exists, forced to speak words and make sounds that have already been captured, his future dictated by echoes of what the cabin has already heard. Ethan has stopped using recording equipment entirely. He's requested that no one record his voice or image. He lives in fear of creating any sound that might be captured, stored, replayed. Because he understands now what the cabin really is. It's not just collecting sounds. It's creating a loop, trapping people in their own recorded lives, forcing them to repeat and repeat, their sounds playing back eternally, overlapping with everyone else who was ever recorded there. All of them trapped in an endless cacophony of their own voices, unable to stop speaking, unable to achieve silence, drowning in the noise of themselves. The cabin is rented out again now, advertised as a perfect retreat for musicians and podcasters, for sound engineers and recording artists. The acoustics are mentioned as particularly unique. If you're planning to record there, I'd advise against it, but you won't listen. Nobody does. The cabin's collection needs to grow and you'll add your voice to it. And eventually you'll hear yourself speaking words you haven't said yet, living a life that's already been recorded, trapped in playback with everyone else who thought they were just capturing sound but were really being captured by it. Story 9. The Hunting Cabin. Robert Dalton and his younger brother Chris planned the hunting trip for months. It was their tradition. Every November they'd spend a week in the woods, just the two of them, no wives, no kids, no work. Robert, 43, was a contractor from Asheville. Chris, 38, taught high school history. Their father had taken them hunting in these same mountains as boys, and now that he was gone, they continued the tradition in his memory. They'd rented a cabin in a remote part of Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, accessible only by a rough 4-wheel drive track. The cabin was primitive, no electricity, no running water, heated by a wood stove, perfect for their purposes. They arrived on a cold Saturday in mid-November, loaded with gear, supplies, and enough whiskey to last the week. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Small, rustic, isolated. One room with 4 bunks, a table, a stove, and shelves stocked with emergency supplies left by previous hunters. The area was known for good deer hunting, and Robert and Chris planned to spend their days in tree stands about a mile apart at the cabin each evening. Everything was normal for the first 3 days. They saw deer, took shots, came close but didn't get one. In the evenings, they cooked over the wood stove, drank, told stories, fell into the easy rhythm of brothers who knew each other well. On the 3rd night, they heard the first gunshot. It came from somewhere north of the cabin, echoing through the trees, a single shot, high-powered rifle by the sound of it. Neither of them thought much of it. They were in hunting territory during hunting season. Other hunters were inevitable, but the shot came again an hour later, then an hour after that, and again. Single shots, always from roughly the same direction, always at exactly 1 hour intervals. By midnight, Robert and Chris were unnerved. Who hunts at midnight? Who takes single shots every hour through the night? Chris suggested it might be someone spotlighting deer illegally, but that didn't explain the precision of the timing. The shots continued all night, every hour on the hour. Neither brother slept much. In the morning, exhausted and irritated, Robert suggested they track down whoever was shooting and politely ask them to stop. It was probably someone camping near their hunting area who didn't realize they were disturbing neighbors. They followed the sound north, hiking through dense forest. The morning was cold and foggy, visibility poor. After about 2 miles, they found another cabin. It was older than theirs, more primitive, barely more than a shack. No smoke from its chimney, no vehicles nearby, no signs of current occupation. The windows were dark. Robert approached and knocked on the door. No answer. He tried the handle unlocked. The door swung open, revealing the cabin's dark interior. Inside was a single room, empty except for a table, a chair, and an old rifle leaning in the corner. The rifle looked ancient, probably from the 1940s or earlier. On the table was a lantern and a notebook. Chris picked up the notebook while Robert examined the rifle. The notebook contained handwritten entries, undated and cramped, difficult to read script. The entries were fragmentary and strange. Still here, can't leave. The shot keeps me bound. Every hour I fire again and it resets. If I stop, what comes next is worse. The deer aren't deer, they only look like deer. When you kill one, you'll see. Don't kill one, don't take the shot, leave while you can. This is someone's idea of a joke, Robert said, trying to scare hunters. But Chris wasn't convinced. The notebook looked old, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was genuinely distressed, not theatrical. They left the empty cabin to their own, unsettled but trying to rationalize what they'd found. That evening, while preparing dinner, they heard the shot again. This time, it was clearly coming from the direction of the abandoned cabin. Robert and Chris looked at each other. They'd just been there. The place was empty. No one was in it. Robert grabbed his rifle and flashlight and they returned to the other cabin, moving quickly through the darkening forest. When they arrived, the cabin was exactly as they'd left it, dark, empty, door standing open. But the rifle in the corner was hot to the touch, as if recently fired. And on the table, the notebook was open to a new page. Fresh writing filled it in the same handwriting but dated that very day. You came. You saw me. But you don't understand yet. I'm not here anymore. I'm the echo of what happened. Every hour I shoot the deer that killed me, but I miss because you can't kill what's already dead. Don't hunt tomorrow. The deer you'll see, it's the same one. The one I've been shooting at for 70 years. If you kill it, you take my place. Robert tore the page from the notebook, stuffing it in his pocket. Someone's screwing with us. Maybe motion sensors, remote recording, some elaborate prank. But that night, neither of them slept. The hourly shots continued, close enough to rattle the windows of their cabin. At 3 in the morning, Chris whispered, "What if it's true? What if someone really is trapped, forced to keep shooting every hour and we walked right into it?" "That's insane," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. At dawn, Chris refused to hunt. "I'm not going out there. Something's wrong with this place." Robert, stubborn and increasingly angry at having his trip ruined, insisted everything was fine. He'd come to hunt and he'd hunt. He left the cabin alone, hiking to his tree stand. Chris stayed behind, sitting on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the woods. Robert sat in his stand as the sun rose, fighting exhaustion. Around 8:30, he saw a deer. A magnificent buck, 12 points at least, the kind of trophy he'd been hoping for his entire life. It moved through the clearing below his stand slowly, almost casually. Something about its movement was wrong, though. It didn't move like an animal. It was too deliberate, too purposeful, as if it was looking for something, looking for him. The buck stopped directly below Robert's tree stand and looked up. It stared at him with eyes that were too intelligent, too aware. Robert looked through his scope, centering the crosshairs on the deer's chest. His finger touched the trigger. In that moment, he remembered the notebook's warning. He hesitated. The deer opened its mouth. What came out wasn't the sound a deer makes. It was a human voice, raspy and desperate. Me. End it. 70 years I've been running, and every hour he shoots and misses. Shoot me and I'll be free and you'll take his place. Shoot me and you'll fire every hour for the next 70 years, bound to this place, unable to leave, echoing forever. Or don't shoot and I'll keep running and he'll keep shooting and you can leave. Choose. Robert took his finger off the trigger. He sat frozen in his stand, watching as the deer turned and walked away into the forest, disappearing into the fog. He climbed down and ran back to the cabin, not caring about noise, about protocol, about anything except getting to Chris. Chris saw Robert coming and met him halfway. "I heard a voice," Chris said. "Something spoke in the woods. What's happening?" They packed in frantic silence, throwing gear into their truck, abandoning equipment they couldn't carry quickly. The hourly shots continued as they loaded up, 9 a.m., right on schedule. They drove out, navigating the rough track too fast, desperate to reach the paved road. As they finally hit pavement and accelerated away, they heard the 10 a.m. shot behind them, echoing through the mountains. Robert and Chris have never gone hunting together again. Robert sold all his firearms. He can't explain why, but the thought of holding a rifle, of looking through a scope, fills him with existential dread. Chris quit his teaching job and moved to Florida, as far from mountains as he could get. They don't talk much anymore. The trip broke something between them, some shared assumption about how the world works. Robert still hears the shots sometimes. Not physically, there's no sound, but in his mind, every hour on the hour he feels it. A phantom gunshot, marking time, reminding him how close he came to pulling that trigger. He's researched the area obsessively, looking for records, for explanations. He found a report from 1953 about a hunter named Earl Higgins who disappeared in Pisco National Forest. His body was found months later in an old cabin, dead of unknown causes, his rifle beside him. According to the report, Earl's watch had stopped at exactly 10 a.m., and his calendar indicated he'd been missing for exactly 70 years, though that was clearly impossible since he'd only disappeared weeks earlier. Robert knows that somewhere in those mountains, someone, or something, is still shooting every hour. The echo of Earl Higgins, or the echo of whoever came before him, trapped in a cycle that's been repeating longer than anyone knows. And the deer is still running, still appearing to hunters, still speaking with a human voice, still offering them the choice: shoot or walk away and stay free. Robert walked away. He made the right choice. But sometimes in dreams he sees the deer again, standing below his tree stand, looking up with two intelligent eyes. And in the dream, his finger is on the trigger and he's already pulling it, and he hears the shot. And he knows it's not 10 a.m., it's 11 a.m., it's 12 p.m., it's every hour forever, and he's the one firing now, bound to the mountains, echoing through time, waiting for the next hunter to come along and make the same choice he couldn't unmake in the dream but somehow managed to unmake in life, though he's no longer certain which version is the dream and which is real. Story 10. The Logbook. Alexandra Chen was hiking the Appalachian Trail when a late-season snowstorm forced her off the trail. At 31, she'd quit her job as a corporate lawyer in Boston to hike the AT, starting in Georgia in March and planning to finish at Mount Katahdin in Maine by October. She was in Virginia, making good time, when the unseasonable November storm hit with brutal intensity. The trail shelter was already full of other hikers waiting out the weather, so a local trail angel had offered to let Alexandra stay in a cabin he maintained for emergency situations. The cabin was about 2 miles off the trail, accessible by a rough path. The trail angel, an elderly man named Walter Sims, gave her directions and a key, warning her that cell service was non-existent and that she should wait out the storm before trying to return to the trail. Alexandra reached the cabin as darkness fell and snow accumulated rapidly. The cabin was small but solid, with a wood stove, canned goods, and supplies. She'd be comfortable here for a few days until the storm passed. She built a fire, heated soup, and settled in, grateful for shelter. On a shelf beside the stove, she found a logbook, a thick journal where previous visitors had written entries. Most cabins along or near the AT had logbooks where hikers left notes, advice, stories. Alexandra flipped through it, reading entries from various people who'd stayed here over the years. Most were brief, thanks to Walter, comments about the weather, trail conditions, the usual hiker banter. But as Alexandra read deeper into the journal, the entries became strange. One, dated 3 years earlier, read, "Don't sleep in the loft. I woke up to find someone standing over me. They were gone when I turned on my light. I moved to the couch downstairs, safer there." Another from 2 years ago, "Something scratches on the walls at night. Sounds like it stops if you acknowledge it out loud, but then it starts again an hour later. I barely slept." A more recent entry dated 6 months earlier. "I read the previous entries and thought people were exaggerating or trying to scare future visitors. They're not. Whatever is in this cabin, it's real. I saw it. Just a glimpse in the mirror. Someone standing behind me who wasn't there when I turned around. I left in the middle of the storm. Hypothermia is better than another night here." Alexandra felt her skin crawl. She looked around the cabin with new suspicion. It was fully dark now, snow falling heavily outside, the wood stove crackling. She was completely alone, miles from the nearest help, no phone service. She told herself the entries were pranks, hikers entertaining themselves by scaring others. But she decided not to sleep in the loft. She'd stay on the couch downstairs just in case. Around midnight, Alexandra woke to the scratching. It was exactly as described, fingernails on wood coming from the walls. The sound moved slowly around the room as if something was circling. Alexandra's heart hammered. "Stop," she said aloud, her voice shaking. The scratching stopped immediately. She waited, listening to the silence and the wind outside. An hour later, the scratching resumed. Again, Alexandra said stop, and again it stopped. This continued through the night. Hourly scratching, hourly commands to stop, no sleep. By dawn, Alexandra was exhausted and terrified. She decided to leave as soon as visibility improved, storm or not. But when she opened the door at first light, she found the snow had drifted several feet deep. The path back to the trail was completely obscured. She couldn't leave safely. She'd have to wait at least another day for conditions to improve. Trapped, Alexandra decided to learn what she could. She read every entry in the logbook carefully, looking for patterns, explanations, anything useful. Most entries were normal years of hikers and hunters staying here without incident. But scattered through the years, every few months, there'd be an entry describing something wrong. The experiences varied: sounds, shadows, feelings of being watched, objects moving, voices. But they shared common elements. Whatever happened in the cabin only occurred at night. It could be stopped temporarily by acknowledgement or commands, and it seemed to escalate the longer someone stayed. The earliest disturbing entry was from 1987. "I don't know what's wrong with this place, but I won't be back. I saw my dead wife in the loft. She died 3 years ago, but she was there, looking exactly as she did the day she died. She said I wasn't supposed to be here. She said this place is for people who got lost and never found their way out. I'm not lost. I'm leaving." Alexandra found more references to people seeing the dead, relatives, friends, even strangers they'd seen die. One hiker described seeing all the roadkill he'd passed on his drive to the trailhead, stacked in the corner of the cabin, watching him with dead eyes that still moved. Another entry from 1995. "This cabin is some kind of way station, a place between living and dying, between found and lost. The dead collect here, or echoes of them do. They're looking for the lost ones, trying to guide them, but we're not lost. We're just visiting. Our presence confuses them. They think we're the ones they're supposed to help move on." As Alexandra read, the cabin grew dark again, early November sunset, barely 4:30 p.m. She didn't want to face another night. She lit lanterns, kept the fire high, tried to prepare mentally. She wrote her own entry in the logbook, documenting everything she'd experienced and read, just in case someone found it later. The scratching started earlier that night, beginning around 7 p.m. instead of midnight. Alexandra commanded it to stop, and it did, but it resumed within 30 minutes instead of an hour. The pattern was accelerating. At 9 p.m., between scratching episodes, Alexandra heard footsteps in the loft above her. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth. She hadn't gone up there. Nothing should be up there. At 10 p.m., someone spoke. A woman's voice coming from the loft. "Alexandra, come up here, I need to show you something." Alexandra didn't respond. She sat frozen on the couch, barely breathing. The voice came again. "Alexandra Chen, I know you're alone, I know you're scared, come up here, I can help you." "Who are you?" Alexandra finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm someone who got lost," the voice replied. "I was hiking. I got turned around. I found this cabin. I thought I was safe, but I never left. Come up here, Alexandra. I want to show you what happens when you never leave." Alexandra grabbed her pack and began putting on her winter gear, boots, jacket, gloves, hat. She'd rather face the storm than whatever was in the loft. As she moved toward the door, the voice became frantic. "Don't go outside, you'll get lost. You'll die in the snow. You'll end up like me, trapped here, trying to warn people, trying to help." Alexandra opened the door. The snow had stopped and the clouds were breaking up, moonlight illuminating the landscape. The drifts were deep, but she could navigate them. She stepped out into the cold, leaving the cabin behind. "Please," the voice screamed from inside, desperate now. "Don't leave me alone, it's so lonely here. Please come back." Alexandra walked into the snow, heading in what she hoped was the direction of the trail. After about 100 yards, she looked back at the cabin. In the loft window, illuminated by the lantern light, was a figure, a woman pressed against the glass watching her leave. The woman's face was gaunt, her eyes dark hollows, her mouth open in a silent scream. Alexandra turned away and kept walking. She navigated by moonlight and intuition, and after 2 hours of difficult hiking, she found the trail. She reached the shelter where other hikers were still waiting out the storm. She told them what happened, showed them the logbook entry she'd photographed on her phone before leaving. Some believed her, others thought she'd had a breakdown from isolation and fear. Walter Sims, when she finally reached him, listened to her story and nodded sadly. "I should have warned you properly," he said, "but most people stay there without incident. The cabin's been there since 1952, and I've been maintaining it for 20 years. Every few years, someone reports something wrong. I keep thinking maybe it'll stop, but it doesn't." "What is it?" Alexandra asked. "Best I can figure from talking to old-timers, a woman did die there. 1953. She was hiking alone, got lost in a storm, found the cabin, but she was already hypothermic. She died in the loft. They didn't find her until spring. Since then, people report seeing her, hearing her. She thinks she's helping, trying to warn people about dying from the cold, but she's the danger now. People who listen to her, who go up to the loft, sometimes don't leave. We've had 3 disappearances from that cabin over the years. Their gear is found, but they're gone, like they just walked out into nothing." Alexandra completed her hike, finishing at Katahdin a month later than planned. The delay from the storm and from taking time to recover mentally set her back, but she finished. She's written about her experience, published an article about haunted places along the AT. Most people think it's creative embellishment, hiker folklore made dramatic for publication. But Alexandra knows the truth. That cabin is still there, still maintained by Walter Sims, still offered as emergency shelter. The logbook is still on the shelf, filling slowly with entries, most normal, some terrified. And in the loft, the woman is still there, still trying to warn people, still trapped in the moment of her death, eternally cold, eternally trying to save hikers from her own fate, not realizing that she's become the thing they need to be saved from. If you're hiking that section of the AT in Virginia, and a kind old man offers in a cabin off the trail, you might want to reconsider. Stay in the crowded shelter. Brave the storm, because the cabin is warm and it's dry and it seems safe. But it's a place for the lost, and if you stay too long, if you listen to the voice in the loft, you might become lost too, not in the storm outside, but in the cabin itself, trapped between living and dying, scratching on the walls, trying to warn the next visitor, eternally cold, eternally scared, never finding your way out.